say one thing in regard to that. If I can remember what it is that
homosexuality, gender.
It's okay. I know what it is. Thank you. Thank you. I need to come back up. Use some keywords. Is that, you know, as a psychotherapist, I'm frankly not a huge fan of the DSM-4, 4/5, whatever it sort of evolves. But the only time that I find it to be helpful really is if it helps someone get the treatment that they need. So if I have to label or identify someone with a number, with a diagnosis, I guess I'm kind of practical, and I don't feel as disconcerted about that as if I do it for no apparent reason, which what I think with GIDC or GID, the point is, okay, you have this diagnosis, and guess what? We're not going to help you with it. We're not going to pay for it. The insurance won't cover it. So that really will piss me off. So.
Question over here. Thank you.
I just wanted to kind of raise a question about the difficulty that I've sensed so far in the conference in thinking about different forms of inequality together with sexuality and gender. Especially in light of Ron's intervention, which I found really useful, to the degree to which you invoke Meryl Singer's idea of this endemic, and looking at the resilience that's evidenced in the folks who are, you know, dealing with 4 or 5 different sort of coming out on the high end of 4 situations, specific kinds of situations. I was thinking, well, what if when we're thinking about the causal pathways for something like depression, part of the issue is that I may be depressed not because I don't identify as gay, but because living in San Francisco is very expensive. And being gay in San Francisco and producing a gay self in San Francisco in the Castro requires usually a white body, a white sculpted body, and perhaps that's not the body I have. It may not be because I'm raised otherwise, or it may be because I am disabled, or it may be because of other reasons. So I wanted to sort of throw that out there because one of the difficulties and challenges that we have in spaces such as this one is articulating clearly how questions of sexuality and gender are always interarticulated with all these other markers, especially as they are lived and experienced in everyday life.
I will say in terms of childhood studies, I am completely interested in the queering effects of color on children and trying to think about this as a category of both sexual strangeness and everything else. We have a long history of who could be a child in this country. And generally the markers, white and middle class, are the markers that give you the sort of notion that you must be of this protected status called childhood. There's a kind of interesting problem where children of color at times are perceived as being too strong, too able to cope, too resilient to actually then be children, and therefore don't sort of deserve these other kinds of protections because they don't need these protections. I mean, this is a problem that weirdly goes back to something like a poem by William Blake, you know, in 1789, The Little Black Boy, in which he can't seem to figure out how to think about the white boy, and the black boy is literally too strong for protection. So I think this is a whole other angle of childhood studies that we have to begin to look at. And I'm very interested in how we might actually be exporting our notion of the innocent child to other parts of the world by using sort of notions of childhood in peril. This is what Sundance films have been about. You were born in brothels, war dance, so that when you find this child in ultra peril, now there's an innocent child. So you actually sort of go to the extreme sort of notions of childhood peril to find this old-style Western concept of the innocent child, which we're partly losing faith in because of childhood sexualization. So I think those complications are just so enormously important right now. And if we just draw that boundary around gay and gender, we're missing all these other equations, class and race being huge to my mind. So thanks so much for the question. Shannon?
Every time I was so glad that you asked the question that you did, and every time this issue comes up of GIDC and children, it's just so fraught. And I, as a transgender person or a transsexual person, I often feel a lot of anxiety, which I was feeling to some degree when you all were talking about it, about conflating gender atypical behaviors on the one hand, and on the other, distress about having a body that you just do not feel at home in. And I think it's interesting. I think that the sort of LGB angle on this often tends to be dangerous generalization, but focus more on the behavior, the gender atypicality, and at least sometimes, especially I think transsexual people are more focused on the need for medical interventions. But I wanted to suggest I do think it's important to keep those things conceptually distinct, although I'm sure there's problems with trying to do that too. Maybe those distinctions break down at the boundaries, but the behavior on the one hand, even just the internal identification, shorn of any behavior, like whether you want to be seen as male or female, and then the body stuff. But part of why I think that's important is because it may be, in fact, I think it probably is, that little kids who identify with her male body but identify as female probably have that same, who knows, but might very well have that same range of gender typical and atypical behaviors. Yeah. And I wanted to share, I was involved in a custody case involving a transgender kid, male to female, and the judge would not believe that this kid was transgender and issued an order taking custody away from the mom who was trying to accommodate the kid, put it with the dad, because this little transgender girl, in addition to liking to wear dresses and stuff, liked to play with swords and do boy things. And the judge was like, well, obviously, then you can't possibly be a transgender kid. So for multiple reasons, I think it might be
That's such an important point. And I should note that there are, a lot of these gender identity scales, they have items like, has your child expressed a wish to be? But it is interesting whether kids of a certain age can even articulate that. That really, it's hard to know what the psychological experience of a 5-year-old would allow them to say, I don't think I am this. The behavior is a lot easier to measure. So I think that's a really valuable point, that you could potentially have some pretty typical behaving child that inside is going, I don't feel at home in this body.
Yeah, Renee, right there. Yeah, great, thanks.
Sorry.
So you're actually holding the mic. That's even.
Yes.
Yeah. She's ahead of the game.
This has been really fascinating, and I really appreciate all of the presentations that have been made. I actually have a number of questions, but I'm going to try to boil it down. The first is going to be sort of piggybacking off the comment second to last. Ron, in your study, you're talking about how you lumped sort of all the variables for all the individuals to try and control for those, and then you came up with all these multipliers. And I'm wondering, in terms of trying to form a queer coalition, political coalition, is your study or other studies drawing out those specific minorities within the gay community and looking at the specific success rates, the resilience rates, and then to draw on this notion that we look at the gay community as homogenous. We're the minority against the majority, but we're such a diverse community. And looking at gay marriage, or which is another whipping boy in this conversation a little bit, as the I don't really think that that's the answer to resolving sort of the homophobia and anti-gay sentiment, and really the focus for a movement to reduce depression and anxiety and all these other things. So I'm just wondering, how can we talk about the other minorities, all minorities within the gay community, and focusing on work to try and deal with those oppressions that then work against resilience?
Yeah, that's a great question. I have a couple of responses. The first is that we now with the multi-center AIDS cohort study, where we've come up with measures of all the variables in the syndemic theory, can apply it to African American men, Latino men, and Anglo men. and we're looking to see whether these life experiences that they report as these men come of age result in the same way of syndemic production. What we can say is that so far from our initial analyses, and these are very, very preliminary, it looks like the Latino men look closer to the Anglo men, and the African American men have much different experiences around identifying as gay and what that means in terms of their home culture responding to it. But that's very preliminary. Sit tight with that. So yeah, the analyses so far have not been done specific to the sub-communities yet. We haven't had the chance, but it needs to go there. I can say also that the analysis that I did with the syndemic analysis has been reproduced in a third world setting, and they're reproducing the results around not only intertwining epidemics but also greater HIV infection among gay men in this developing world setting who have multiple psychosocial conditions. The other thing I wanted to respond to about the hurtfulness of the Castro, that is really true. And when you talk to gay men in San Francisco about how do you feel about the gay community, almost invariably in our qualitative work in that city is their first response out of their mouths is there is no gay community. And deny that such a thing exists. And that one of the pieces of the syndemic theory is that men are exposed to, or boys are exposed to, structural, cultural violence against kids who are different. And then they go from being the only one or the outlier to being one in a million, they get to these so-called refuges where you have high prevalence rates of depression, substance use, violence, and so on, and that these things, and depending on the resiliencies that they bring to these settings, these things can snowball and spin out of control. So then what would be some of the practical ways that we can protect our kids? One of the things I would love to do would be to find a state with anti-bullying laws where these things are never enforced, right? And do a randomized trial, we randomize probably 20 or 30 schools, and provide real support to make sure that kids can come and get an education in state-funded institutions without fear of violence victimization, irrespective of who they are. And so you'd work with the PTAs, you'd work with parents, you'd on and on and on and on and on to make sure that kids are protected as they try to get an education. So that it's not just the Castro that needs work. Another thing would be training parents. Why don't we take the view that it's not the kids who are screwed up, but rather, that if we help the parents cope better with kids that are different, and help the parents do things that are far less hurtful to these children, that the violence victimization that they experience as kids, they'll be able to cope with it better, they won't get it at home, and they'll grow up to be healthier adults. I think a theme in all of our presentations has been that queer kids of whatever way that we're gay or trans get exposed to structural violence, and we see it around us on a daily basis as we're growing up. Now, there's a larger violence literature, and the larger violence literature says that people who are raised in this way, not just gay people, but human beings who are raised to believe that their life on this earth is a waste of oxygen and that they are the legitimate objects of violence where the perpetrators are not punished in any way and they have no way to protect themselves, those people have a hard time thriving as adults. And that's what's going on with our communities. And so there's a lot of things upstream we can do that aren't just about our communities, too. If that makes sense.
Yeah. Yeah, done. Okay.
I've been hearing a lot of talk lately about how doctors are prescribing a drug to stop kids from going through puberty if they're going through gender identity issues, and I'm just wondering if that's true, and if it is, what you guys think about that.
I mean, I've heard similar things. I honestly, since I'm not a clinician, I don't know what the standard of care is. I know that another thing to remember, some kids who struggle with gender identity issues are actually intersex. They have disorders of sexual differentiation. And there are actually a number of ways to treat that hormonally depending upon the reasons for the condition. So I have not heard of doctors just, on a blanket, like, let's just stop puberty until we figure out what's going on. I have a sense that that's not probably really common. Dave, you have your hand up, and I'm sure Don can speak to that as well.
There is a drug, and I'm blanking on the name of it, that can be used to delay puberty, and they found that it can be used fairly safely. Like when kids stop taking the drug, then they proceed through puberty. And so there's a number of people right now that are trying to think of sort of develop best practices for using this medication. And there's a group out of the Netherlands that's published on sort of what their protocol is for using the medication. And it has great promise because it sort of allows everyone to get more comfortable with, including the kid.
And so it's both girls and boys. It'll stop puberty equally both.
And prevent the development of those secondary sex characteristics, which are physically so difficult to overcome surgically. And so I think as kids sort of start to recognize their trans identities younger and younger, this is going to be something that we really are going to have to sort out, and people are beginning to talk very seriously about it.
It just reminded me of sort of the cost breakdown when, for instance, trans girls, I know that there's androgen blockers that people can take, and I'm less certain about trans boys. But all of those things, the laser hair removal, well, there's $8,000. Your hair transplants, $18,000. I mean, and I'm just talking sort of the physics, the physical characteristics, not sort of the internal emotional pieces. But yeah, I think that's pretty cool. And I also wanted to say too that I have seen some little kids in my practice whose parents come in and they say, my kid's 4 and wants to wear a dress, and those people usually don't come back to my office. Like, I might get one visit with them, and what Ron was saying about working with parents, which I think is true with most mental health, parents bring their kids in, and it's 90% of the time that the parents are really the ones that need some help and some education, more so than their kids. But so I think the sooner we can get started, the better. But parents, and especially parents of kids of biological boys that identify as female, often the parents wonder, well, are they really gay, but they're trying not to be gay, so instead of being gay, they want to become a girl? Like, that's a really big question. Yeah, that's a solution in the kid's mind to not be gay, is just like, what? Doesn't make a lot of sense, but that's one of, because that's much easier than being gay. But that is one thing that comes up with parents.
Don?
An obvious difference between, say, today versus 15 years ago is that there's a remarkable amount of material out there on the internet. And I was wondering if any of you would speak to what you think that kind of, there's both good information and bad information out there. But it's available now, so that even preteens can go, they all have access to computers, they can go out and find this material, often rather in a haphazard and not particularly deliberate way. Any comments about what you think that does to the whole issue of trying to understand what's going on with yourself?
I would just like to say something quick about that, which is the representational field has exploded. I mean, since I was a child, I did not know it was possible for a woman to become a man. So as a child who I think was deeply transgendered, and if I were growing up in this time period, though that's very complicated to know all the different factors that would have happened, might have wanted to make a transition. It wasn't even on the table as an idea that I had. I never met a live gay person until I went to graduate school. Never met a person who openly said in front of me, I'm gay. We just forget that. We forget the massive changing representational field and how enormously important that is in terms of just seeing possibilities, seeing movies, seeing TV, seeing things where these categories are talked about and possibilities are given. So the internet is one part of that, but TV and film and that entire representational world is a huge part, and I think there's no way to predict the difference that that's going to make in terms of the range of possibilities that will be available to people. And, of course, the complicating factors that that brings, too.
And I also think that just the internet, people get online, and whether it's good information or bad information, they go, oh my gosh, this is a real thing. And sometimes they see my name and they write me a letter, you know, or they make a phone call or they send an email. And I wonder if that's a good portion of why we're seeing more and more trans people, or why I'm personally seeing more and more trans people. Trans folks are coming out more because it's just something now that they can see and read about, and again, whether it's good, bad, or neutral.
I'd like to add something from, I mean, the internet can be, the internet's a double-edged sword, and all these wonderful things can happen, and creation of possibilities, but I also worry about the harm it can cause, particularly with gay men and HIV, and so some of the work that we've been doing in the Far East, in Southeast Asia and China, there's now a vast explosion of, because of the internet, men able to locate each other. So I chatted with a guy in China who's an internet provider for gay men, and in his company, he has 500,000 Chinese men on this website, but that there's no opportunity for these men to get access from their community about HIV prevention, about community building, about anything. It's just basically manhunt. And so, you know, very eroticized pictures of men. Now, the other thing about China, we know from population-based, the scale of stuff in China is enormous, so that we did a population-based sample, and when we looked at the number of men who had sex with men in China, 80% of these guys were married. And the other thing is that when you extrapolate the 2% of Chinese men who have other sex with men, you end up with a population larger than the entire city of London. And so, you know, this vast population of men learning how to make love with each other without really the information or the skill sets they need to protect each other. And the internet's going to facilitate that. So we've got to figure out a way, not only in our own country, but around the world, about how to do a better job of harnessing this for good, not just, you know, and mitigate the bad effects that are possible.
Great. Cliff, and then I think we're going to have time for maybe one or two more questions. Yes.
Great. So this conversation has been exciting. It's a great start, I think. And I want to try to bring it back to Carlos's question, which was picked up by another, because I think that there's a profound challenge to the conversation that we'll have over the next couple of days in here. Lisa, at one point you talked about how the DSM doesn't make a distinction between distress that's caused by homophobia or by other causes. And I think one of the things that Carlos is asking is, what would that distinction look like? Can we make that distinction? Because one theme that we've sort of seen through the talks is there's an idea that the distress in the community is to be, the blame for it is to be placed elsewhere on society and homophobia. And I think this notion of what it is to be gay and to produce a gay self in San Francisco may mean to have a six-pack and access to certain clubs, and that this, is that homophobic? Is that internalized? Can you place that outside, inside? Can you then answer the question, is someone really gay? What does it mean to be really gay, and is it good to want to become really gay? And in particular, I think we can ask this question about the drivers of syndemic, and the question of what role does risk play in the creation of a gay self in San Francisco. The idea of barebacking, and is that homophobic? Is that internalized? And is risk an alternative form of masculinity? Right? So certainly risk, taking risk, is a kind of masculine trope. And also in thinking about childhood, that is, what did you want to do when you were a child? Dangerous things, right? Just this idea, I'm just trying to engage it. I mean, it's a deep question. I don't think we can answer it easily, but I think we shouldn't push it aside.
God, I wouldn't know where to begin with all that. One thing I would say with Carlos's question that I find when I have conversations with men of color that that the Castro, the white guys are comfortable. Well, actually, they're not. And this white guy never. I lived in San Francisco for 21 years, and this white guy never felt comfortable in the Castro. Men are socialized to compete with each other. And what we did, it seemed to me what we did in the Castro was we competed with looks and money, and we don't give each other very many warm fuzzies. And we're not very good at supporting each other. And so there was this always thing of, get your face on there and not, I didn't feel, it was a hard place to make a friend, is always the way I felt about it after 21 years and from day one to the end. And so there is a lot of pathology that's reproduced in the Castro. We bring a lot of, when we go to these big urban gay ghettos as refugees, we bring a lot of our problems with us. So another structural intervention might be to, help make it safe for gay men to stay home on the farm. And one of the things I think the internet has done that's been wonderful is when I came out, you had a choice, San Francisco or New York. There's probably now 15 gay cities, all of which are a 4-hour drive from everywhere in America, with the exception of out west where the populations are thinner. And I was struck when I moved to Atlanta how many gay men there were actually from the Southeast, and they chose Atlanta because it was a safe place to be gay, but they could drive home for Thanksgiving and Christmas. So they kept the social capital of their connection with their families in the South, but they were able to live as openly gay men in Atlanta, and they weren't hiding anything, and they were doing, I thought, something much more healthy than saying, the heck with you, I'm gone, and disappearing to the West Coast or disappearing to New York. And so I think another thing that we can do that's really, really, really helpful about addressing syndemic production would be to build communities outside of the largest gay ghettos. Columbus, Ohio is turning out to be a huge gay city. That's a good thing. Salt Lake is too. Make it safe to be gay all over America and create communities where we were raised. That will also help enormously around the competition that one sees on Castro Street.
I mean, obviously, too, we've got to get our act together and get down with economic justice issues as queer people. If we don't start broadening our conception of all the different things that are tied together and the intellectual incoherence of treating things as singular factors, I don't think intellectually we can get very far. So I love the question. Yes, Jessica Peters in the blue sweater there.
Okay, I wanted to touch on, what Lisa was talking about for the DSM. And so I was reading on a website that they were revising the DSM-4 to go into the DSM-5, and that there's this website on the APA that you can make your comments to talk about adjustments. And I was just wondering if you knew of any adjustments that were being made to the GIDC and to talk about those issues so that it is not such a disease. So...
That's been fairly stable. That's not been one of the diagnoses that's undergone a lot of change. It was introduced in 1980, and it hasn't undergone too much change. I mean, the big controversies now are, going on with Asperger's and autism and some of the changes going on there. But, I'm not sure what the cost-benefit ratio would be of, sending your comments to the APA about gender identity disorder. Dave, go ahead. What are the proposed changes? Broadening or narrowing? Or? Oh, okay. And so what direction?
within the professional and the lay community about the disorder.
And just to reiterate that the whole notion that having the diagnosis is not a uniform bad, that if it, for a lot of conditions, you can't get insurance coverage without a diagnosis of something. So if someone's like, well, why on earth would we want the category? Well, gender dysphoria as the justification for surgical treatment, some have argued, well, we need some sort of medical, legal justification to argue that we deserve to have some form of accommodation. So, that's the reason that some would say, let's not just take it out, because it's serving a social and medical and financial function.
Okay, so we
should anyway.
We are out of time for this panel. The good news for you is we've got a wonderful keynote that'll be starting in about 15 minutes. It is at the theater, which is just right down the sidewalk. You can follow any number of us down there. It's the Post Theater. Looks like a little movie theater. And that will be beginning at 11:30. We've got another panel this afternoon, and the nice thing is many of the questions that some of you still had for these panelists I think will fit quite well into the next session as well. All right, so do not lose those questions. Bring yourselves, your questions, to the keynote, and then also to this afternoon's panel. Thank you. See you at 11:30 for Lisa Dugan. Thank you to our panelists.